Hi again, welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the Swedes finally managed to agree on a new crown prince, one who also managed to stay alive. They elected the French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, and after a quick change of religion and name to Karl Johan, he was adopted by King Karl XIII and officially became Crown Prince of Sweden. One of the reasons the Swedes had picked Bernadotte was that he was a gifted military man. They hoped that he'd be able to recapture Finland from Russia. But Bernadotte wasn't just an excellent officer, he was also completely unsentimental regarding the future fate of Finland. To him, there was no point in trying to recapture anything and risk provoking Russia. Instead, he wanted to expand Sweden westward by conquering Norway from Denmark. Today, we'll have a look at what the Norwegians thought about that. Episode 124, Crisis Means Opportunity. Norway had been in union with Denmark since the late 1300s. That meant that Norway wasn't a part of Denmark, but still a separate kingdom. Nonetheless, in practice, the King of Norway was the King of Denmark. And even though the two kingdoms were supposed to be equal, Denmark had always been the dominant part in the union, thanks to its larger population and economy, not to mention the fact that the king always resided in Denmark. Norway had seen a few bad centuries, but the second half of the 1700s had actually been great. The Norwegian economy had developed rapidly, even though it was still lagging far behind Denmark. In the first years of the 1800s, Norway's population was fast approaching 900,000. That meant that Denmark was still more populous, but the gap was shrinking from generation to generation. The vast majority of the Norwegians were peasants, and 90% of them lived in the countryside. The 1700s had been a good century for Norwegian farmers as well. Many of the larger landowners had started to lose interest in agriculture, which wasn't very profitable in Norway. Instead, they'd taken an interest in forestry, mining, and other businesses selling land to peasants. As a consequence, the number of landowning farmers grew during these years, and these farmers also became more affluent when they no longer had to pay rent on the land that they worked. They invested their new disposable income in their farms, both in terms of livestock and better tools and equipment. But they also upgraded their homes, installing wooden floors and window panes made of glass. Some could even splurge and buy cotton dresses for their wives, and even silver spoons or a grandfather clock. But not everyone was enjoying these good times. In the year 1800, roughly 1/3 of the Norwegian peasant population still rented a small plot of land where they tried to make ends meet, usually without silver spoons or grandfather clocks. And Norwegian farming was still, on the whole, lagging behind that in England, the Netherlands, or even Denmark. And it wasn't just because the climate in Norway was less suited for agriculture. Farming just wasn't as developed, not as profitable as it had become elsewhere. And the road network was abysmal, turning into impassable mud every spring and fall. The bad spring roads will come into play later in this episode, actually. Another problematic aspect of Norwegian agricultural life was that the population growth meant that the country had basically run out of arable land. Second sons, who couldn't expect to inherit the family farm, had to start looking for alternative ways to support themselves, either by learning a trade, becoming sailors, or going into service in the household of some other farmer who owned a bigger plot of land and maybe even a silver spoon or two. The 10% of Norwegians who didn't live in the countryside dwelled in one of the country's cities, towns, or villages. None of these were particularly impressive in terms of size. Bergen was still the largest city, but it only had 20,000 inhabitants. The capital, Christiania, today renamed Oslo, had just under 10,000. Despite the peasants dominating Norway as far as numbers were concerned, they didn't run the country. Instead, in the 1700s, two other groups of people had become the leading men of Norway. As I've already noted in previous episodes, Norway didn't have much of a domestic nobility anymore. And ever since the union with Denmark, Danes had dominated the key positions in the Norwegian state apparatus. But now, things were slowly changing. First of all, the civil servants who managed the country for the absent king were now increasingly born in Norway, not in Denmark. Only the most senior ones, like the district governors, were still mostly Danish-born and raised, and the Danes still made sure that the most important districts were always governed by Danes. Just like the case with the civil servants, more and more of the officers in the army were also born and raised in Norway, unlike the fleet, where most of the officers were still Danish. The second group of people whose power and influence had grown throughout the 1700s was the businessmen. They too were mostly Norwegian. This phenomenon, with native Norwegians claiming an increasingly prominent position in Norwegian society and administration, inevitably had an effect on the relations with Copenhagen, especially toward the end of the 1700s, when the American and French revolutions spread ideas about national sovereignty and governments based on the will of the people. In leading circles in Norway, patriotic ideas that favored Norway above the union with Denmark started to develop, even though it was still mostly talk in drawing rooms and pamphlets with limited circulation. But in parallel, expressing liberal or progressive political ideas or preferences in general was getting increasingly risky. During most of the 1700s, the censorship had been, if not dormant, then at least drowsy. But the French Revolution made the authorities in Copenhagen nervous, and they started to clamp down on various dangerous ideas, seizing publications and handing out fines. This affected Norwegian society as well, with the added taboo surrounding the questioning of the continued union between Norway and Denmark. Despite the best efforts by the censors, we've already seen in previous episodes that the connection between Norway and Denmark weakened during the Napoleonic Wars, when the Danish authorities struggled to keep up regular contact with Norway due to the British blockade. And it wasn't just the Danish authorities who struggled to get through the blockade. Also, the grain shipments needed to feed the growing Norwegian population were intercepted by the British. This, in combination with the closure of British markets to Norwegian wood, fish, and other exports, led to widespread unemployment as well as starvation and death. Tens of thousands of Norwegians died from starvation and hunger-related diseases during the war. When this, essentially Danish war, was forced upon Norway after decades of strong economic development in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, that too undermined the authority of King Frederik VI in his northern kingdom. His decision to side with Napoleon had brought a disaster upon Norway. Beyond the difficult economic situation, a growing number of Norwegians disliked that the Danish authorities fought against a Norwegian university and a Norwegian national bank. They hoped that this kind of national institutions would strengthen Norwegian autonomy, which of course was the very reason Copenhagen fought against it. They also disliked the increasing censorship, the privileges, and stifling absolutist political climate. In addition, Norwegian businessmen wanted to get rid of various monopolies and other limitations in commerce, and Norwegian farmers wanted to be allowed to sell their produce more freely and to get rid of other regulations that hindered economic development. As the war went on, the king in Copenhagen started to receive reports that the situation in Norway was growing increasingly volatile. As a concrete sign of the breakdown of authority, hunger riots broke out in 1812. People rioted in several Norwegian cities and towns, such as Kristiansund, Trondheim, Bergen, Kristiansand, and Arendal. Peasants and burghers marched in public granaries and plundered them. Guards and public officials who tried to stop them or calm them down were unceremoniously pushed aside or even attacked. The situation was dangerous, bordering on open revolt. At the same time, Swedish agents were urging the Norwegians to rise up. The men of 1809 and later Bernadotte promised the Norwegians a constitution, a parliament, and more liberties if they broke free from Denmark and joined Sweden instead. After the coup in 1809, the Swedes had written a new constitution, chucking the legislation that Gustav III had pushed through the Riksdag after his two coups in 1772 and 1789. Danish King Frederik VI, a firm believer in absolutism and the king's divine right to rule, didn't like that one bit, and he was even less keen on such dangerous ideas infecting Norway. As a perhaps desperate countermeasure, King Frederick decided to appoint his half-cousin and heir, Christian Frederick, governor of Norway. Christian Frederik should not be confused with the Frederick Christian who was almost elected Crown Prince of Sweden in the last episode. Christian Frederik was the son of King Frederick's half-uncle, who, for simplicity's sake, was also called Frederick. The closest common ancestor of the two half-cousins was their paternal grandfather, the popular but toxic King Frederik V. The reason Christian Frederik was the heir to the Danish throne was that King Frederik VI didn't have any sons, at least not within wedlock. He and his wife/cousin, Queen Maria Sophia Fredrika, had two daughters, Carolina and Wilhelmina, but since women couldn't inherit the crown, it would go to his closest male relative, who was this half-cousin, Christian Frederik. The king and his heir were polite to each other, but they weren't close. Maybe the king was annoyed that he didn't have a direct descendant who could succeed him. Or maybe he didn't think Christian Frederik was cut out to be king. When he was appointed governor of Norway, Christian Frederik was 27 years old. He had no formal education whatsoever, neither in politics nor in military matters. He was completely uninterested in the day-to-day business of governing a country, and he had never served in the armed forces. This was in stark contrast to King Frederik VI, who not only was a seasoned military officer, but who had run the kingdom since he was 16 years old because his father, Christian VII, had been insane. Go back to episode 114 to refresh your memories if you'd forgotten about Crazy King Christian and his grey eminence, Struensee. Despite his shortcomings in terms of education and experience, Christian Frederik had begged the king to let him go to Norway and govern the place for quite some time already. By now, in 1813, he was also urging the king to cut ties with Napoleon before it would be too late. The French were in full retreat after their failed invasion of Russia. Christian Frederik thought it was inevitable that Napoleon would fall, and he didn't want the French emperor to drag Denmark down with him when he did. But King Frederik still believed in Napoleon's military genius and had faith that the emperor would manage to pull through and win the war. He cited French official sources to back up his claims, whereas Christian Frederik preferred to read British reports that were more connected to reality than the French propaganda. Still, he couldn't make the king change his mind. So maybe that's why the king finally agreed to send Christian Frederik to Norway, so he wouldn't have to hear him go on and on about how Denmark needed to ditch its alliance with Napoleon. When Christian Frederik arrived in Christiania, he was met with enthusiasm, seen by many as someone who could save Norway. That might seem strange considering his total lack of training for the job, but Christian Frederik had actually been interested in Norway for quite a while. Already back in 1806, he had become president of the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences in Trondheim, and he had been a strong supporter of the initiative to establish that university in Christiania his half-cousin had been so skeptical of. He also enjoyed the support of a network of influential friends in Norway. Among them was a man called Carsten Anker, a wealthy landowner with Norwegian patriotic leanings. Anker influenced Christian Frederik by warning him that Sweden had designs on Norway as early as 1810, when Sweden had lost Finland. Christian Frederik hoped that he'd be able to save Norway thanks to his own clever moves and Europe's disdain for that parvenu lawyer's son, Bernadotte. As long as Denmark just broke off from Napoleon in time, the King of Britain and the Emperor of Russia couldn't seriously take Norway from the Oldenburgs and hand it over to a common nobody from the French provinces, right? But in 1813, things still looked bleak. Denmark could no longer bear the crippling cost of the war, and the crown was bankrupt. When the Sixth Coalition had chased the French out of Germany, Denmark found itself isolated and vulnerable, and Bernadotte, leading the Northern Army of the anti-Napoleon coalition, made sure to exploit that vulnerability, taking his 30,000 Swedish troops that had participated in the war to defeat Napoleon and turned them against Denmark. King Frederik VI finally had to face the music. He had clung to Napoleon for too long, and now he had no choice but to sue for peace. The peace agreement was signed in Kiel in January 1814. It was actually two separate treaties, one between Denmark and Britain, and one between Denmark and Sweden. The first one, between London and Copenhagen, wasn't too bad from a Danish perspective, all things considered. Clearly, Britain wasn't out to fleece the Danes for siding with Napoleon. To begin with, the Brits agreed to return all Danish lands and territories they'd occupied during the war, with the exception of the island of Heligoland off the German coast in the North Sea. It was too strategic a position to hand back. The stipulation with the most far-reaching financial consequences was probably the demand that Denmark abolish the slave trade in its colonies. The Danes also had to switch sides in the war and contribute 10,000 soldiers under Bernadotte's command to fight the French army. In exchange, London promised to pay £400,000 annually for the upkeep of this force. The rest of the treaty concerned stuff like financial compensation to Danish subjects whose property had been seized during the war. The treaty with Sweden was a far more bitter pill to swallow for the Danes. The negotiations went on for 10 days, with the Danish side trying to water down the treaty as much as possible. On January 15th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the negotiators finally signed the agreement. The biggest ticket item was Article 4, where King Frederik was forced to renounce the claims to the Kingdom of Norway for himself and his successors irrevocably and forever. He also had to accept that Norway would instead enter into a union with Sweden. It's unclear which of those two provisions stung the most. An ever so slight silver lining was that the Swedish crown took over all the debts and financial obligations of Norway. An even broader silver lining was the decision that Sweden would give Swedish Pomerania to Denmark as a kind of territorial compensation once the Danes turned over the Norwegian fortresses Fredriksten, Fredrikstad, Kongsvinger and Akershus to the Swedes. For the Swedish government, giving up these last possessions on the continent was a relatively easy sacrifice to make. The Napoleonic Wars had proven that Sweden could do little to hold on to these German territories if one of the great powers wanted it. It was just as well to give it up now, when Stockholm could still get something in exchange. Even though the Treaty of Kiel was a great success for the Swedes, they didn't get everything they wanted. In the first Swedish draft, Norway was to have ceased to be a separate kingdom, and instead would have been incorporated into Sweden. In the final version, Norway remained a kingdom in its own right, merely in union with Sweden. That meant that Norwegians were allowed to keep their own laws, customs, privileges, and freedoms. Another important compromise that the Swedes had to agree to was what Norway actually meant. In the final version of the treaty, Norway was defined as the Diocese of Kristiansand, Bergen, Akershus and Trondheim, as well as the coastal islands and the northern districts of Nordland and Finnmark, all the way to the Russian border. That meant that the overseas islands, historically under the Norwegian crown for hundreds of years, were left out. So Greenland, Iceland and the Faroe Islands now shifted to be Danish possessions. In practice, they'd been run by the Danes for over 400 years already, but technically the king in Copenhagen had ruled them in his capacity as King of Norway. When they eventually found out, the Norwegians were not happy about any of this. They weren't particularly pleased that the King of Denmark had traded them away without consulting them, and they were especially miffed that he'd kept the overseas possessions for himself, effectively stealing them from Norway. But the isolated Norwegians still didn't know anything about what had been decided in Kiel. Only on January 17th, 2 days after the Treaty of Kiel had been signed, King Frederik sent a letter to his heir and governor of Norway, Christian Frederik. In it, he informed the people of Norway that they had been released from all their oaths of allegiance to him and his family, and he urged them to enter the union with Sweden peacefully and orderly. In a separate letter to Christian Frederik, the king instructed him to hand over all the fortresses to the Swedes and then returned home to Denmark as soon as possible. The letter didn't reach Christiania until January 24th, and Governor Christian Frederik chose not to publish it immediately. He had seen this coming, but wasn't planning on accepting it without a fight. He had his own agenda. The day after, on January 25th, 1814, the Norwegians finally heard that the war was over. But the news didn't come from the governor, but from the newspaper Tiden, which proclaimed that peace had arrived in Scandinavia. The paper did not, however, say anything about Norway having switched hands. Even though there had been no official announcement, Christiania was soon buzzing with rumors, not least since a first British ship anchored in port on the same day as the news of the peace reached the city. The British sailors could tell the stunned Norwegians that they were now to report to Stockholm instead of Copenhagen. It didn't take long for the rumors to start spreading across the country. The reason Christian Frederik hadn't officially announced that his half-cousin was no longer King of Norway and that he himself had no legal claim to any kind of authority in the country was that he was playing for time. He knew that the Norwegians resented the idea of Sweden taking over even more than they disliked Danish rule, and he wanted to channel that resentment toward a popular uprising. Christian Frederik hoped that he'd be able to lead the Norwegians in a successful defense against an impending Swedish invasion. That wasn't exactly a pipe dream either. Every Swedish invasion attempt in the last century had failed, so why wouldn't it fail this time as well? Christian Frederik expected the grateful Norwegians to make him king of an independent Norway based on his right to inherit the Norwegian crown. Then, when he'd eventually inherit the Danish throne from his half-cousin, he'd be able to re-establish the Danish-Norwegian Union again. But if he wanted any of this to happen, he needed to act fast. So, no sooner had he received King Frederik's letter with the instructions to hand over the country to Sweden and return home before he started to organize the resistance. As a first step, he traveled to Trondheim already at the end of January in order to check the mood in the leading circles there. Christian Frederik was encouraged to discover that the people in leading positions in Trondheim were in favor of resisting a Swedish takeover. But, to his chagrin, he realized that they weren't willing to buy his argument that he had a natural right to the Norwegian crown. It's true, they argued, that he was next in line after King Frederik, who had now renounced his claim to Norway, but the king had done so also on behalf of Christian Frederik, so the governor didn't have a better legal claim to the crown than any random guy walking down the streets. Jurists present at the deliberations in Trondheim argued that after the Treaty of Kiel, the right to decide who was to be King of Norway had reverted to the Norwegian people. But even though they weren't willing to hand Christian Frederik the crown on a silver platter, they were, however, willing to elect him King of Norway, eventually, and on their own terms. Christian Frederik had to make do with that and traveled back to Christiania to continue his preparations. When he returned to the capital, the content of the Treaty of Kiel had become general knowledge. Just as Christian Frederik had predicted, the Norwegians didn't like it. They grew even more unwilling when Karl Johan Bernadotte responded to their skepticism by threatening to enforce the Treaty of Kiel by military means. The Swedish threats played right into Christian Frederik's hands, especially since Bernadotte was tied up on the continent and didn't have any military resources to send to Norway, at least not yet. But the war against France was winding down, so Christian Frederik knew he had no time to waste if he wanted to succeed with his plans. As a first step, he called various Norwegian notables to a meeting on February 16th. The meeting was to take place in his buddy Carsten Anker's estate at Eidsvoll, some 50 kilometers northeast of the capital. Christian Frederik hadn't given up on the possibility of claiming the Norwegian crown on the basis of his right as the next in line of succession. But, just like in Trondheim, the notables gathered for the meeting in mid-February rejected that idea. They too argued that the right to decide who was to be king had reverted to the people after the Treaty of Kiel, and they urged Christian Frederik to call a national assembly that would write a brand new constitution for Norway. Only then would the representatives of the nation have the authority to elect him king. They did, however, agree to appoint him regent in the interim period. Christian Frederik finally understood that he had no other choice if he ever wanted to become King of Norway. So, after the meeting, he returned to Christiania, and on February 19th, he made the official announcement that the Norwegian people had been released from their oaths to King Frederik VI. He did not, however, tell them to accept a union with Sweden, like he'd been instructed to do. Instead, he said that the Norwegian people were now independent and free to choose how it wanted to be governed. This was groundbreaking stuff, until then only heard in revolutionary America and France, never from the mouth of a senior member of the Danish royal family. As regent, Christian Frederik then announced the elections to a constitutional assembly that would be held within 8 weeks. The elected delegates would then gather at Eidsvoll on April 10th to put together a constitution for Norway for, as he put it, the liberty of the people and the good of the state. The same day, he sent a letter to all the bishops and district governors, as well as to the commanders of the army and the fleet. In his letter, he explained how the elections should be carried out. The elections themselves should take place in church, right after a mass on a special day of prayer. That day should be February 25th, or as soon as it could be arranged after that date. There wasn't much time, but Christian Frederik was determined to have everything settled before Bernadotte would have a chance to do anything to stop him. Using churches made sense. Everyone had to go to church, so they'd hear about the elections from the priest, and the buildings themselves were large enough to house the voters. The priests were also civil servants used to carry out royal instructions, so they could be trusted to organize the elections without causing any trouble. Finally, holding the elections in church on a day of prayer after Mass created an air of religious legitimacy to an activity that, legally speaking, stood on shaky ground. Because let's not forget that Christian Frederik had no authority to do what he was doing. He'd received clear instructions to cooperate with the Swedes and return home to Denmark. Technically, he was now in open revolt against the King of Denmark and the King of Sweden. But in the heady days of late winter 1814, small details like that didn't seem to matter much. On election day, the priests should ask the congregation to swear an oath to defend Norway's independence and to risk their life and blood for the fatherland. A dozen of the most prominent members of each congregation would also have to put their oath in writing, signing a document to that effect. That way, Christian Frederik hoped to bind the whole people to his revolt. In the countryside, where the congregations were small and far apart, the elections were indirect, meaning that the congregants would elect representatives who would then go on to meet representatives from other congregations to elect the actual delegates for the Constitutional Assembly. They would each elect 3 delegates, one of which had to be a farmer. In small towns with only one church, the elections were to be direct, and they would elect 1 delegate each. In larger towns with more than one church, the elections would be indirect and elect representatives that would meet to elect delegates just like they did in the countryside. The capital, Christiania, sent 2 delegates to the assembly. So did Kristiansand and Trondheim. Bergen, which was still the largest city in Norway, was allowed to send 4 delegates. In the armed forces, every regiment or corps was to elect 2 delegates each, and one of these 2 had to be a private soldier or a non-commissioned officer. In practice, that meant that they were peasants in civilian life. Once elected, all the delegates should travel to Eidsvoll, where they were to meet at the Constitutional Assembly, held at the estate belonging to Christian Frederik's good friend Carsten Anker. The deliberations were to start on Easter Sunday, April 10th. On February 25th, the planned day of prayer and accompanying elections were carried out throughout the southeastern part of Norway. That's the districts closest to the capital, where people had had enough time to arrange things. Christian Frederik had a busy day attending the services in 2 separate churches, both the cathedral and the castle church at Akershus. In the following days and weeks, the rest of southern Norway followed suit, with days of prayer and elections being held as far north as the Trondheim district. Only adult men were allowed to take the oath and vote, and in Bergen, children and female servants were not even admitted into the churches on the day of prayer. Furthermore, only the adult men were allowed to sit down. The women had to either stand at the back or keep to the galleries. Despite the clear instructions that Christian Frederik had issued, there were, perhaps inevitably, a bit of irregularities here and there. In Christiania, there were reports of many voters who'd forgotten to bring their ballots, and of illiterate voters who asked others to fill out their ballots for them. In the town Kristiansand, only a few people actually knew about the election, so only a handful of votes were cast. One major was elected both as a representative of his military unit and his district. A lieutenant from another military unit was elected even though he was only 17, and you had to be at least 25 years old to stand for election. In Trondheim, 2 people were elected to represent the city, but they refused to participate in the Constitutional Assembly, so 2 new delegates had to be elected. In several locations, there were also some people who didn't want anything to do with the elections and refused to take the required oath. But the biggest obstacle in all of this was the geography of Norway. The country was simply too large to be able to get the word out and to organize any elections in time. Due to bad weather along the coastline, the news reached the Nordland district just north of Trondheim on March 20th, almost a month after the elections had been held in the southeast. The local governor set the elections in his district for April 29th because he wanted the fishermen from the Lofoten archipelago to have a chance to return from their current fishing expeditions first. But before the district had a chance to elect any delegates, the governor received the news that the Constitutional Assembly had already convened and had been deliberating for over a week. So he just cancelled the elections, since no delegates from his district would have a chance to reach the assembly in time to join it. Even further north, in the district Finnmarken, the instructions to hold elections arrived even later, on April 14th. The district governor immediately started to organize things without knowing that the Constitutional Assembly had already started its work. Apparently, Christian Frederik had forgotten to add the deadline to his instructions, so the elections in Finnmarken were held on August 1st, 2.5 months after the Constitutional Assembly had already finished its work. As you've probably realized by now, the election process was far from perfect. Still, I have to say that it was pretty impressive if you take into account that this was the first time ever that Norway held nationwide elections. Oh, almost nationwide, but still. It's especially impressive considering how quickly it was all organized. Of course, the breakneck speed was also the reason for so many of the problems, but Christian Frederik was on a tight deadline. He needed to have a complete and signed constitution, and preferably a crown on his head, before Karl Johan Bernadotte had time to bring the Swedish army around to crush the Norwegian dreams of independence. The delegates represented a relatively broad spectrum of Norwegian society, but before we're all swept away by Norwegian patriotism, I would like to point out a few flaws. First and foremost, obviously, all the delegates were men. Women didn't have the right to vote or the right to be elected. Secondly, we should keep in mind that Christian Frederik had done what he could to manipulate the outcomes of the elections. He wanted delegates who'd support his policy of independence, with him as King of Norway. That's the reason he'd made sure to guarantee spots in the assembly for the farmers of Norway. He counted on them being more patriotic, less enthusiastic about a union with Sweden. The peasantry was also, as a rule, more inclined to support and to trust the king, or, in his case, the king-to-be. In other words, Christian Frederik had tried to get as many peasant delegates as possible, but it wasn't because some burning desire to hear the voice of the poor and downtrodden masses. It was because he expected the poor and downtrodden masses to listen to him without talking back. For the same reason, Christian Frederik made sure that the more cosmopolitan and independent-minded merchants, especially from the southeast, where they had connections to Sweden, could send as few delegates as possible. Out of the 112 delegates to the Constitutional Assembly, 37 were farmers, 5 were iron masters, and only 13 were merchants. The rest of the delegates were civil servants, meaning that they made up the majority of delegates who gathered at Eidsvoll that Easter Sunday, 1814. Many of the civil servant delegates were also inclined to defer to Christian Frederik, since they had all taken an oath of loyalty to him, and the early 1800s was still a time when people took their oaths seriously. These civil servants would dominate the Constitutional Assembly, not only by virtue of their numbers, but also measured in speaking time. The farmers and non-commissioned officers that Christian Frederik had made sure to pack the assembly with played a minor role in the deliberations, and many of them never even opened their mouths. The assembly debates were conducted almost exclusively by civil servants and a few merchants. Next time, we'll take a closer look at what they eventually decided at Eidsvoll in the spring of 1814. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.